long before kings wrote their names into clay, and long before empires announced themselves with armies and monuments, a vast power was already rising from the mud of Mesopotamia. Its people built cities, counted grain, sealed goods, moved resources across dangerous lands, and changed civilization before history could fully speak. Yet its rulers remain almost nameless, its story buried in broken tablets and forgotten ruins. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If ancient mysteries like this are the kind of history you enjoy, long before the first kings of Sumer step into written memory, before royal names are pressed into clay, before battles, dynasties, and temple hymns begin to speak in a language scholars can read, there is already a world rising from the mud. It stands in the low, shimmering plain of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates lose their certainty and break into channels, marshes, reed beds, lagoons, and fields that seem to float between land and water. From a distance, this world leaves almost no voice behind. No proud emperor explains himself. No court historian records the beginning. No stone monument announces the founding of a realm. Yet beneath later cities, beneath the names that history remembers, archaeology finds something older, stranger, and in some ways more powerful and organized human world, vast enough to change the direction of civilization before history, as we usually imagine it, has even begun. The first mystery is not that people lived there. People had lived across the ancient Near East for thousands of years, planting grain, herding animals, making pottery, burying their dead, and watching the seasons with the intimate attention of survival. The mystery is that in this southern plain, sometime in the 4th millennium BCE, scattered villages begin to turn into something much larger. Settlements swell, temples rise, labour becomes organised, goods are counted, clay is marked. Seals are rolled across wet surfaces to prove that someone has authority over what is stored, moved, or owed. A landscape of farms and reed huts begins to gather itself into cities, and at the centre of this transformation stands Uruk, a place so large for its time that it seems almost impossible, a city before the age of famous kings, a city that rules in ways still difficult to name. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story ahead is not simply about one ancient city. It is about the moment when human society crosses a threshold and does not return. To understand how unsettling this forgotten world really is, it helps to step away from the familiar image of ancient empire. Later empires announce themselves loudly. Egypt carves kings into cliffs and temple walls. Akkad, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Rome leave inscriptions, armies, treaties, taxes, roads, and monuments meant to outlive ordinary people. They want to be remembered. They build memory into stone. But the world before written history is different. Its power survives mostly as traces broken bowls, discarded clay ceilings, temple foundations, heaps of pottery, mud brick walls reduced to shapeless mounds, and small tablets whose signs hover between accounting and writing. What survives in the record suggests authority, planning, and long-distance influence, but not the kind of empire that later ages make easy to recognize. That is why the title Forgotten Empire must be handled carefully. Scholars still debate whether the Uruk world should be called an empire at all. It may not have had a single ruler. It may not have had armies marching under banners, governors stationed in conquered provinces, or official borders drawn across the land. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for what happened. Yet something from southern Mesopotamia spreads astonishingly far. Uruk-style pottery appears hundreds of miles away, Administrative tools travel with merchants, settlers, or officials. Buildings in distant places echo southern forms. Small outposts appear along routes that connect the alluvial plain to the mountains, forests, and mineral zones it desperately needs. By the standards of later empire, it is shadowy. By the standards of prehistory, it is enormous. The land itself seems both generous and dangerous. Southern Mesopotamia has no mountains, little timber, and almost no stone. It is not a place that naturally provides everything a growing society wants. Its wealth lies in water, mud, reeds, fish, dates, and grain, and in the human ability to turn difficult wetlands into a productive machine. The rivers bring fertility, but also uncertainty. Floods can nourish fields or destroy them. Channels can shift. Salts can rise through irrigated soil. Marshes can protect and isolate, feed and suffocate. The earlier city builders do not inherit an easy paradise. They create order in a world that must be managed constantly. Their greatness begins not with conquest, but with coordination. In that coordination, one can sense the beginning of something new in human life. Grain must be harvested and stored, workers must be fed, herds must be counted, bricks must be moulded, dried, and carried. Reeds must be cut, canals must be cleared, beer must be brewed in quantities large enough to supply labourers and households, wool must be processed, boats must move along waterways, offerings must pass into temple precincts. Someone, or some institution, must know what comes in and what goes out. Before full writing, power already needs records. It needs memory outside the human mind. So clay becomes a quiet instrument of control. There is a strange intimacy in these earliest administrative traces. A clay ceiling may preserve the impression of a woven basket that vanished 5,000 years ago. A broken tablet may record numbers without giving a story. A beveled rim bowl, mass-produced and plain, may have once held a ration of grain or bread for a worker whose name is lost forever. These are not royal treasures. They are not golden masks or jewelled weapons. They are the debris of management. And that is precisely why they matter. They reveal a society where scale has become a problem and where solutions are being invented in mud, habit, and repetition. The people living inside this world do not know they are standing before history. They do not imagine that future scholars will divide time into before and after writing, or search through their refuse for the birth of civilization. To them, life is immediate. The river must be watched, the barley must be protected, the temple household must be supplied, children grow among reeds, animals, clay walls, smoke, insects, heat, and the heavy smell of wet earth. Boats slide through brown channels. Workers carry baskets of mud brick under the sun. Potters shape vessels by the thousands. Seal cutters carve tiny images into stone that will travel farther than their owners ever do. Priests or administrators stand near storerooms, not as distant myths, but as living people managing a world that is becoming too complex to run by memory alone. And still, silence surrounds them. The earlier signs that lead toward writing do not yet open a window into inner life. They count more than they confess. They record commodities, not dreams. They preserve administration, not emotion. That silence can make the Uruk world feel cold, almost mechanical, but that would be misleading. Every number pressed into clay points back to bodies' hands cutting reeds, backs bending in fields, eyes watching floodwater, feet moving through mud, mouths fed by ration bowls. The forgotten empire before history is not forgotten because it was small. It is forgotten because it came before the kind of evidence that lets people speak clearly across time. So the story begins with a contradiction. Here is a civilization powerful enough to reshape cities, trade, labour, accounting, and authority across a huge region. yet obscure enough that its own political shape remains uncertain. Here is a world that may have ruled without leaving a king list, expanded without leaving conquest inscriptions, and transformed history before history learned how to narrate itself. Its monuments are made of mud brick and memory. Its documents are still half silent. Its people vanish into categories of grain, sheep, beer, cloth, and labour. But beneath those fragments lies one of the great turning points of the ancient world, the rise of urban power before the age of written names. The forgotten power of Uruk does not begin with walls or rulers. It begins with water moving through a flat country, splitting and rejoining until the land seems less like a firm surface than a breathing edge between river and marsh. Southern Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BCE is a place of unstable abundance. The great rivers carry silt from faraway mountains, spreading it across the low plain in slow gifts of fertility. Around them stretch wetlands thick with reeds taller than a person, pools alive with fish, mudflats marked by birds, and channels where narrow boats can move more easily than carts. The horizon is wide, but never empty. It shimmers with heat, insects, palms, smoke from hearths, and the pale lines of levees and fields made by human hands. This world is not the cracked image many people imagine when they hear the word Mesopotamia. The southern plain is difficult, yes, but it is also alive with resources. Reeds provide building material, mats, baskets, fences, boat parts, and fuel. Mud becomes brick. River clay becomes bowls, jars, tablets, ceilings, and walls. Fish can feed communities when crops fail. Date palms offer fruit, shade, fibre, and wood, though not the heavy timber needed for grand construction. Barley grows well enough in the salty soils of the south to become a foundation of survival. Sheep and goats move across the margins, cattle graze where water and grass allow. The entire landscape functions like a vast, messy workshop, offering almost everything needed for ordinary life and almost nothing needed for luxury or monumental ambition. That imbalance matters. A city can rise from mud and grain, but if it wants stone, metals, strong timber, precious minerals, and certain kinds of prestige goods, it must look beyond itself. The southern plain forces cooperation and exchange because it lacks what mountains and forests possess. In a strange way, the poverty of the land in stone and metal may help create one of its greatest strengths. People who live there must learn to organize movement boats along rivers. Caravans across dry routes, messengers, traders, labor teams, storage systems, and agreements with distant places. What survives in the record suggests that southern Mesopotamia does not become influential because it is naturally complete. It becomes influential because it learns how to manage incompleteness. At the heart of that management is irrigation, though it should not be imagined as a single grand invention appearing all at once. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how early and how centrally controlled the first canal systems really were. Some channels may have begun as natural waterways improved by small communities. Others may have required coordinated labour on a larger scale. Over time, however, water is guided more deliberately. Fields need timing. Too much water can drown the crop. Too little can leave the earth hard and useless. Silt can clog a channel. Salt can creep upward through the soil when irrigation is poorly managed. The fertility of the land is real, but it is not free. It must be negotiated year after year. This is one of the quiet engines behind urban life. Where many households depend on shared water, they must settle disputes, maintain canals, divide labour, decide when to open and close channels, and organise repair after floods. A village can survive with memory, custom, and local authority. A growing town needs more. It needs people who remember obligations, measure deliveries, assign work, store surplus, and redistribute food. The river does not simply feed the city. It trains the city in coordination. Long before political power becomes visible in royal inscriptions, the environment is already pushing people toward institutions. The seasonal rhythm of the plain gives life a particular shape. In the cooler months, fields green with barley. In harvest season, work intensifies, and the fate of entire communities depends on the crop being gathered, processed, and protected. Grain must be dried and stored against rodents, damp, theft, and spoilage. Animals must be watched. Reeds must be cut when useful. Mud bricks must be made when the heat can dry them. Boats become essential because water connects what roads cannot. A load that would exhaust a line of people on foot can move more smoothly through canals, and the marshes, often treated as obstacles by outsiders, become highways for those who know them. There is a lesser-known intimacy in the materials of this world. The reed is not just background scenery. It is one of the foundations of civilization in the south. Reed bundles can form walls and roofs. Reed mats can line floors. Reed boats can cross marshes where wheeled vehicles would sink. Even the architecture of early monumental buildings, later translated into mud brick forms, may preserve memories of reed construction. The line between humble and grand is thinner than it appears. A temple platform may rise above the plain, but the logic of its construction still belongs to mud, reed, labour, and repeated repair. Nothing in this environment stays finished for long. Mud brick buildings require maintenance. Floodwater eats at edges. Heat cracks walls. Wind covers surfaces in dust. A city made from mud is always partly returning to mud. That fact gives Mesopotamian civilization a different rhythm from stone-built cultures. Its monuments do not dominate the landscape forever in the same way as pyramids or cliffs carved with royal faces. They must be rebuilt, raised, levelled, and renewed. Beneath later structures lie earlier ones, stacked like compressed memory. The result is the tell, the great mound formed by generations of human occupation, where old houses, temples, courtyards, rubbish, ashes, and broken pottery slowly become an artificial hill. Inside these mounds lies the proof that ordinary activities can accumulate into historical force. A pot breaks and is discarded. A floor is resurfaced. A wall collapses and is filled in. A temple is rebuilt on the remains of an older sacred place. Over centuries, the city rises physically on its own past. The people doing this do not think of themselves as creating an archaeological archive. They are making repairs. They are solving immediate problems. Yet their repeated acts preserve a record of how small communities learn to support large ones. The wetlands also shape imagination and authority. A temple in such a place is not merely a religious building separated from daily life. It stands within a world where survival depends on forces that are powerful, unpredictable, and only partly controllable. Water gives and takes. The harvest succeeds or fails. Disease moves through dense settlements and damp places. Storms, insects, heat, and flood all remind people that life is fragile. Sacred authority, administrative authority, and economic authority may not be separate in the way modern categories suggest. No single explanation fully accounts for how power formed there, but the environment makes it easier to understand why people gathered around institutions that promised order. So before Uruk becomes a name attached to urban greatness, before its influence travels outward, the land itself prepares the possibility. The marsh teaches movement, the river teaches timing, the field teaches dependence, the canal teaches obligation, mud teaches rebuilding, reeds teach adaptation, grain teaches storage, scarcity teaches exchange. In this flat, wet, difficult country, civilization does not rise by escaping nature. It rises by binding itself to nature so tightly that every wall, bowl, boat, ration, and seal still carries the imprint of water. The first steps toward Uruk's forgotten power are almost too ordinary to notice. A village grows a little larger, a storage room is added beside a house, a shrine is repaired, then rebuilt more carefully than before. A family produces more grain than it can eat at once, and that surplus must be kept somewhere safe. A potter makes vessels not only for neighbours, but for people he may never know. A group of workers clears a channel, and someone must decide who appears, who brings tools, who receives food, and who has failed to do his part. None of these changes looks like the birth of the empire when seen alone. Together, over generations, they begin to pull society away from the intimate scale of kinship and towards something larger, denser, and harder to escape. Across southern Mesopotamia, small farming communities do not simply become cities because people decide that cities would be impressive. They become cities because many slow pressure accumulate. Population grows. Irrigated fields can support more mouths than dry farming alone. Surplus allows some people to spend more time making pots, tools, textiles, ornaments, boats, and administrative objects instead of farming every day. Shrines gather offerings and perhaps authority. Storehouses gather goods and, with goods, influence. The movement from village to town is not a clean line. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much of this process was peaceful cooperation, how much was competition, and how much was controlled by emerging elites. But what survives in the record suggests a world where households are increasingly tied to institutions larger than themselves. The temple becomes one of the great engines of this transformation. It is tempting to imagine a temple only as a sacred place, quiet and set apart, filled with ritual and mystery. In early Mesopotamia, it is probably much more than that. It may own or manage land. It may receive grain, wool, animals, fish, beer, and labour. It may organise craft production. It may feed workers. It may act as the visible centre of a community's obligations to gods, leaders, ancestors, and each other. This does not mean every detail is clear. The early evidence does not explain itself neatly, and later Mesopotamian temple systems cannot simply be projected backward without caution. Still, the growing scale of sacred architecture suggests that some institutions are becoming powerful enough to command labour far beyond the household. Mud brick architecture makes this power visible. In earlier villages, buildings may be modest, practical, and close to the needs of family life. Over time, certain structures become larger, more formal, and more carefully planned. Platforms rise. Walls thicken. Rooms are arranged for storage, movement, and controlled access. Public or ceremonial buildings begin to stand apart from ordinary houses. Their very construction implies organisation. Someone must gather labourers, provide food, plan the building, produce bricks, move materials, and maintain the finished structure. A monumental building is not just a monument after it's complete. It is a social machine during its creation. It turns human time, muscle, and obedience into architecture. One of the more surprising clues to this changing world is the spread of standardized objects, especially the plain beveled rim bowl. These rough mass-produced bowls appear in huge numbers at Uruk period sites. They are not elegant. They are not made to impress. Many look as if they were shaped quickly by pressing clay into a mould or forming it with minimal care. For a long time, archaeologists have debated their purpose. One influential interpretation sees them as ration bowls, used to distribute measured portions of grain, bread, or food to workers attached to temple or institutional labour. Others have suggested different functions, and no single explanation fully accounts for every context in which they appear. Yet their sheer abundance points toward repetition, standardization, and large-scale provisioning. They belong to a world where people are being fed in organized ways. That is a major change. In a small village, food moves through family ties, neighborly exchange, obligation, and custom. In a larger institutional system, food can become a tool of administration. A worker receives a ration because he has performed labor. A household owes goods because it is tied to a field, a herd, or a temple estate. Grain enters a storehouse and returns as measured support. This does not necessarily mean oppression in every case, but it does mean dependency. To live within such a system is to be counted, even before one's name is written. The bowl in the hand becomes part of a larger order. Craft specialization deepens the transformation. The potter, the weaver, the brewer, the seal cutter, the metal worker, and the boat builder all belong to networks of supply. A brewer needs grain. A weaver needs wool or flax. A metal worker needs materials from far beyond the plain. A seal cutter needs stone that southern Mesopotamia cannot provide locally. As crafts become more specialized, communities become more interdependent. No household can easily provide everything for itself. The city grows not only because more people live close together, but because their lives are increasingly woven into systems of exchange and production. This is where hierarchy begins to leave faint but persistent traces. Some buildings are larger than others. Some goods are controlled more carefully. Some people have access to seals, storage rooms, administrative knowledge, or sacred spaces. Some burials may hint at unequal status, though early social differences are not always easy to read. The signs are not as dramatic as later royal tombs filled with wealth, but they matter. Inequality often begins quietly, not with crowns, but with control over grain, labor, ritual, and information. The person who can authorize a seal, open a storeroom, assign work, or measure rations holds a kind of power that does not need a throne to be real. Yet this growing complexity also depends on cooperation. A city cannot be built by command alone. It requires habits that many people accept because the system feeds them, protects them, connects them to gods, gives them work, or binds them to a shared identity. Early urban life is not merely a trap, it is also an opportunity. It offers access to goods, ceremonies, markets, craft skills, and collective strength. Migrants from smaller settlements may have been drawn toward larger centers by food security, labor demand, marriage ties, religious prestige, or simple necessity. What survives in the record suggests that the city is both a promise and a burden. By the time Uruk begins to dominate the southern landscape, the essential ingredients are already in place. The rivers and marshes have provided the setting. Irrigation and storage have created dependence. Temples and public buildings have gathered labor. Crafts have multiplied. Standardized objects have entered daily life. Authority has begun to settle into institutions that are larger than any one household and older than any one generation. The village has not disappeared completely, but it has been drawn into a new orbit. Human beings are learning to live at a scale that requires management, and once that scale appears, it changes what power can become. By the time Uruk rises into view, the older village world has not vanished, but it has been overshadowed by something new enough to feel almost unnatural. The city does not appear as a sudden miracle. It gathers itself from countless earlier changes, fields and canals, storage and labor, shrines and workshops, boats and ceilings, ordinary people drawn into wider systems of obligation. Yet at some point the scale becomes difficult to explain as ordinary growth. Uruk is no longer simply a large settlement among others. It becomes the center of a world, and around it spreads a cultural force that reaches far beyond the marshes and barley fields of southern Mesopotamia. This is the moment when the forgotten empire begins to take shape. Though even the word empire remains uneasy. Later empires leave sharper outlines. They have rulers who claim conquest, borders defended by armies, officials sent into provinces, tribute collected under threat, and inscriptions that declare the greatness of a king. Uruk's power is older and stranger. It spreads through pottery styles, administrative habits, architecture, seal imagery, trade outposts, and settlement patterns. It moves along rivers and across plains into northern Mesopotamia, Syria, parts of Anatolia, and the highland edges of Iran. The signs are widespread enough to suggest a system. They are ambiguous enough to keep scholars debating what kind of system it really was. At the centre stands Uruk itself, known in later Sumerian tradition as one of the great cities of the land, associated in memory with kings and legends, but already ancient before those stories take their final shape. During the 4th millennium BCE, Uruk becomes extraordinarily large by the standards of its time. Estimates vary because ancient cities are difficult to measure, especially when later occupation and erosion obscure their earlier limits. But the settlement appears to have covered hundreds of hectares at its height. For a world still emerging from village life, that scale is astonishing. It means streets, districts, workshops, public buildings, storage areas, and dense populations whose food must come from organised hinterlands. It means a city that can no longer be understood as a magnified village. It is a different creature. The power of Uruk is visible in what archaeologists call the Uruk expansion, a broad spread of southern Mesopotamian material culture into distant regions. In some places, this influence appears as imported goods or local imitation. In others, it appears as enclaves or settlements with strong southern characteristics, as if people from the Uruk world established themselves far from home. Sites such as Habuba Kabira in Syria have often been discussed as examples of planned Uruk-related settlements beyond the southern heartland. Though the exact nature of their relationship to Uruk remains debated, were they colonies, trading stations, administrative outposts, migrant communities, or something less formal? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every site. What makes this expansion so fascinating is that it does not look identical everywhere. In some regions, local communities adopt selected Uruk styles while maintaining their own traditions. In others, the southern presence appears more intrusive. Pottery forms, beveled rim bowls, cylinder seals, clay ceilings, numerical tablets, and distinctive architectural features create a pattern that is too coherent to ignore. Yet the pattern is not simple enough to call straightforward conquest. It is as if Uruk radiates a way of doing things, a package of administration, production, exchange, and status that can be carried, copied, adapted, resisted, or abandoned depending on the local situation. This may be the deepest meaning of Uruk's forgotten rule. It is not only land that is being controlled, it is procedure. It is the method of organizing goods and people. A later empire may rule by law, army, and governor. Uruk's world may have spread through the practical power of accounting, rationing, sealing, and exchange. Whoever controls the flow of grain, wool, metals, timber, stone, and labor controls more than objects. They control time, dependency, and trust. A sealed container says that someone has guaranteed its contents. A tablet says that something has been counted. A standardized vessel says that distribution follows a repeated pattern. These are humble tools, but they create authority that can travel. The cylinder seal is especially revealing. A small carved stone cylinder could be rolled across wet clay to leave a repeated image. turning a personal or institutional mark into a visible claim. The images may show animals, humans, ritual scenes, processions, or symbolic arrangements whose meanings are not always fully recoverable. A seal is tiny enough to fit in the hand, but it participates in a vast social transformation. It identifies, authorizes, protects, and remembers. In a world where goods move across distance and pass through many hands, the seal becomes a portable form of power. It is art, administration, identity, and control compressed into a small object. Uruk's influence also depends on desire. Southern Mesopotamia needs resources it does not possess, but distant communities may also desire what Uruk represents. The city's goods, styles, rituals, and administrative practices may carry prestige. To use Uruk pottery, to participate in Uruk exchange, or to host Uruk-style buildings may have signalled connection to a wider and more powerful world. This is how cultural influence often works. It is not always imposed from outside. Sometimes people adopt foreign practices because they're useful, fashionable, sacred, profitable, or politically advantageous. Scholars still debate how much of the Uruk expansion was driven by southern agents and how much by local elites choosing to engage with a rising system. The result is a world that looks imperial from one angle and networked from another. There may have been no single emperor in Uruk directing every movement. There may have been no unified state in the later sense. Instead, there may have been a cluster of institutions, cities, temple households, merchant groups, and elite interests that together produced an expansion larger than any one person could command. That possibility makes Uruk more mysterious, not less. It suggests that empire-like power can emerge before empire has a name for itself. It can grow from administrative habits, economic hunger, religious prestige, and urban momentum. By this stage, the story has moved beyond the local rise of a city. Uruk has become a gravitational force. People far from the southern marshes are now touched by its objects and methods. Clay bowls, seals, tablets, and building plans carry its shadow into landscapes of stone, steppe, and mountain edge. The forgotten empire has not yet spoken in the voice of kings, but it has begun to shape how distant communities count, store, trade, and imagine authority. Its rule is not written as a boast. It is pressed quietly into clay. The farther Uruk's shadow spreads, the harder it becomes to ask the simplest question: who is actually in charge? Later history gives easy shapes to power, even when those shapes conceal as much as they reveal. A king stands at the top. Officials serve beneath him. Armies enforce his will. Laws are issued. Taxes are collected. Conquered lands are named. And royal inscriptions tell the world who claims responsibility. In the Uruk world, the evidence points toward authority everywhere. But the faces behind that authority remain blurred. There are institutions, storerooms, seals, ration systems, monumental buildings, and signs of organized labor. There is control without clear biography. There is power before the age of named rulers. This does not mean that Uruk society had no leaders. It would be difficult to explain its scale without some form of concentrated authority. Large buildings do not raise themselves. Canal maintenance does not happen by accident. Workshops do not produce at institutional scale unless someone coordinates materials and labor. Grain does not move into storage and back out again without rules, memory, and enforcement. Yet the nature of that authority remains one of the central mysteries. Scholars still debate whether early Uruk power rested mainly in temples, in emerging secular elites, in household heads, in councils, in priestly administrators, or in some mixture that does not fit later categories. The evidence remains incomplete because the society has not yet left the kind of texts that would tell us plainly. the temple precincts offer the strongest visible clue. At Uruk, monumental sacred architecture grows to a size that would have been impossible without broad social commitment. These buildings are not only places of ritual, they are centers of storage, redistribution, production, and social gathering. The sacred and the economic are not easily separated. A temple may command labor because it belongs to the gods, but the food that sustains that labor is counted, stored, and measured by human hands. A priestly figure may appear to serve divine order, yet that service can also organize fields, herds, workshops, and rations. In such a world, religious authority can become administrative authority without needing to announce a distinction between the two. Still, it would be too simple to imagine priests ruling alone from high platforms. Early urban society is likely more complicated. Wealthy households may have controlled land and labor. Specialist administrators may have managed goods on behalf of larger institutions. Local leaders may have negotiated between kin groups and temple demands. Skilled craft workers, merchants, and seal holders may have possessed influence of their own. What survives in the record suggests not a primitive simplicity, but a dense and developing system in which several forms of power overlap. The problem is that archaeology often preserves the tools of authority more clearly than the relationships behind them. A sealed lump of clay can say that a jar, basket, storeroom, or door was controlled. It can show that access mattered. It can show that someone's mark carried recognized authority, but it cannot always tell us whether that person was a priest, a steward, a merchant, an official, a household representative, or a servant acting under orders. A numerical tablet can show that grain, animals, or labor were counted, but not always who made the decision being recorded. A building plan can show restricted rooms and controlled movement, but not the conversations, fears, ambitions, and bargains that gave those rooms meaning. Uruk's power is visible as structure, but elusive as personality. One of the most striking features of this world is that control appears before full writing. The earliest tablets are not literature. They do not tell myths, preserve speeches, describe battles, or praise rulers in flowing language. They are administrative devices, practical and narrow, recording quantities and categories. They emerge from the need to manage things that exceed ordinary memory. That fact is quietly revolutionary. Writing in this setting does not begin as poetry or philosophy. It begins because someone needs to know how many sheep, how much barley, how many jars of oil, how many workers, how many measures of beer. Civilization's first written memory is bookkeeping, which is less romantic than legend but perhaps more revealing. The absence of royal names in these earliest records creates a strange atmosphere. Power is everywhere, but the individual ruler remains hidden. This may reflect the limitations of early writing, which was not yet suited to narrative. It may also reflect the way authority was actually organized, more institutional than personal, at least in its surviving traces. Later, Mesopotamian kings will tie themselves to gods, cities, and temples, presenting royal rule as cosmic order. But before those kings become legible, the city itself seems to act as the main force. The institution may matter more than the individual. The storeroom, the seal, the temple, the ration list, and the work gang are the visible organs of control. The imagery on cylinder seals gives another partial window into this system. Some scenes show figures feeding animals, processing goods, carrying offerings, or participating in ritual arrangements. Later scholars have identified a figure sometimes called the priest-king in Uruk, a bearded man with a distinctive headband and skirt, often shown in ceremonial or authoritative contexts. He may represent a ruler, priest, elite official, mythic figure, or idealized leader. No single interpretation fully accounts for all appearances, and the title priest-king is itself a modern convenience. Yet the image hints that leadership could combine ritual, economic, and political roles. Authority may have been embodied in someone who mediates between gods, people, and goods. There is something almost unsettling about a society where the first clear evidence of power is not a crown, but administration. The people of Uruk are not merely obeying a warrior chief standing above them. They are entering a world where power is embedded in systems. A person might owe labour because of land, kinship, debt, obligation, temple service, or dependency. A ration might feed him, but also bind him. A seal might protect stored goods, but also exclude those without authorization. A tablet might preserve accountability, but also make people legible to institutions that can demand more from them. The Forgotten Empire rules not only by commanding bodies, but by organizing the terms under which bodies work, eat, and move. This does not make Uruk uniquely harsh. All large societies must solve problems of coordination, and early urban institutions likely provided real benefits: food security, ritual belonging, protection, access to goods, and participation in a larger world. But every solution creates a new kind of vulnerability. Once people depend on centralized storage, ration systems, and managed labour, they become exposed to failures within those systems. A bad harvest, corrupt distribution, broken canal, or political struggle can affect thousands. Complexity gives power its reach, and fragility its scale. So Uruk's authority remains suspended between visibility and silence. We can see its footprints in mud brick, clay, seals, bowls, and tablets. We can sense its command over labour and resources. We can follow its habits across distant landscapes. But the men and women who made decisions remain mostly nameless, their motives hidden behind institutional debris. The forgotten empire that ruled before history was written may not have ruled like later empires at all. It may have ruled through temples. Storerooms, accountants, rituals, obligations, and the quiet terror of being counted. Out of all the objects that survive from the Uruk world, the most powerful may be the least dramatic, not temples rising from the plain, not carved images of solemn figures, not distant colonies carrying southern habits into foreign lands, but small pieces of clay shaped, marked, sealed, dried, and discarded. They are easy to overlook because they do not look like treasure. They are not made from gold or lapis lazuli. They do not glitter in museum cases with the obvious beauty of royal art. Many are plain, damaged, and difficult to read. Yet inside them lies one of the deepest revolutions in human history, the moment when memory begins to leave the body and enter matter. Before writing, people count. Before writing, people remember. They know how many animals belong to a household, how much grain has been harvested, which neighbours owe labour, which fields need water, which baskets have been filled, which jars have been sent downriver. In a small community, memory can live in relationships. A debt is remembered because the people involved know each other. A promise is enforced by kinship, reputation, custom, and the watchful nearness of village life. But Uruk is not a small community anymore. Its institutions are too large, its goods too numerous, its labour too widely organised, its trade too distant. Memory must become portable. It must survive beyond the mind of one person. It must be checked, repeated, and trusted by strangers. This need gives rise to a world of tokens, sealings, numerical marks, and eventually proto-writing. The full story is complex, and scholars still debate the exact path by which these systems developed. But the broad direction is clear. Long before complete writing record speech, clay objects are being used to represent quantities and categories of goods, small tokens, often shaped in simple geometric forms, may stand for sheep, measures of grain, jars of oil, or other commodities. Some are placed inside hollow clay envelopes, sometimes called bulli, which are sealed on the outside. The envelope protects the record, but also conceals it, so impressions of the tokens may be pressed into the exterior. Eventually, the logic of the system changes. Instead of placing tokens inside clay, people can impress or draw signs directly onto a tablet. The record becomes flatter, more efficient, and more abstract. It is a quiet transformation, but its consequences are enormous. A token is a thing that stands for another thing. A mark on clay stands for a token, which stands for grain, animals, labour, or goods. Human beings are building a chain of representation. They are learning to trust signs. This does not yet mean writing in the later sense, with grammar, literature, royal statements, and myth. The earliest tablets from the Uruk period are often administrative, numerical, and difficult to interpret. Many signs remain undeciphered or only partly understood. They preserve accounting more than language, but the mental leap has already occurred. Clay can hold an obligation. A mark can remember what a person might forget. Authority can travel in symbolic form. The surprising thing is how practical this breakthrough appears to be. Writing does not emerge first as a way to tell the great story of creation, praise a king, or preserve a beloved song, at least not in the surviving record. It emerges because growing institutions must manage food, animals, workers, containers, textiles, and time. The earliest scribes are not poets in the later Romantic sense. They are administrators of reality. They stand near storerooms, workshops, fields, and temple households, translating the movement of material life into marks. Their work may be dry on the surface, but it is one of the foundations of civilization. Without records, scale is fragile. With records, power can expand. A clay tablet changes the relationship between people and institutions. A spoken order fades unless remembered. A tablet remains. A personal agreement can be denied. A sealed record is harder to ignore. A storeroom manager can claim uncertainty. A tablet can preserve account. This does not eliminate fraud, conflict, or error, but it changes the battlefield. Control becomes more durable. Accountability becomes more formal. The past, or at least one narrow administrative version of the past, becomes an object that can be held in the hand. The cylinder seal deepens this new world of verification. If tokens and tablets remember quantities, seals identify authority. A seal rolled across wet clay leaves a distinctive design. Repeated with each turn of the cylinder, it may close a jar, secure a bundle, mark a door, or authorize a transaction. Breaking the sealing means breaking the evidence of control. In this way, clay becomes both record and lock. The seal holder carries a portable identity, and the impression left behind says that someone recognized by the system has acted. This is not writing exactly, but it belongs to the same revolution, the movement from trust based only on presence to trust supported by signs. There is a human drama hidden inside this technical change. Imagine a worker receiving grain from an institution whose storehouse he will never fully see. Imagine a herder whose animals are counted into categories. Imagine a boatman carrying sealed containers down a river. Knowing the clay on the lid proves whether the contents have been disturbed. Imagine an administrator pressing a seal into wet clay with practiced motion, perhaps without thinking that the gesture will outlive his city. These people are not inventing history as an abstract idea. They are solving problems of delivery, obligation, suspicion, and scale. Yet by solving them, they create the tools that history will later depend upon. The marks themselves are not easy gifts to modern scholars. Proto-cuneiform tablets can be frustratingly silent. Some signs are recognizable through later developments, while others remain uncertain. The system records numbers and commodities with a precision that does not always translate into narrative understanding. It is like hearing a vast machine working behind a wall. One can detect rhythm, weight, and purpose, but not every mechanism. What survives in the record suggests intense administrative activity, but not the full social world behind it. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for how these early records were taught, who could read them, or how widely their meanings were understood. Still, even their difficulty is revealing. Writing begins not as a universal human tool, but as specialized knowledge. It likely belongs to a limited group trained in signs, numbers, formats, and institutional needs. To control records is to control a new kind of power. The scribe, or proto-scribe, stands between the living world and its clay memory. He may not rule like a king, but he makes rule possible. He gives institutions an artificial mind, one that can accumulate information beyond the lifespan or honesty of any one person. From this point onward, the Forgotten Empire is no longer merely a network of fields, canals, temples, and trade routes. It is becoming a recorded system, even if its records are still narrow and half-mute. Clay tokens and silent accounting do not explain everything about Uruk, but they reveal the pressure at its core. The city has become too large for memory alone. Its power depends on counting, sealing, measuring, and remembering in durable form. Before history can tell stories, it must learn to keep accounts. Before kings can boast, someone must count the grain that feeds their workers, and in the low, wet plain of southern Mesopotamia, the first steps toward written history are pressed not in triumph, but in administration, one small mark at a time. As the clay records multiply and the seals begin to carry authority from hand to hand, Uruk itself grows into something that must have overwhelmed anyone approaching it from the open plain. The city rises low and broad at first, not like a mountain of stone, but like an immense human-made swelling in the landscape, a place where mud brick walls, reed roofs, courtyards, platforms, workshops, streets, and sacred precincts gather until the horizon is no longer only river and marsh. For people born in smaller settlements, Uruk must have seemed almost impossible in scale. It is not merely a place where many families live close together. It is a new kind of environment, made by human coordination, fed by fields beyond its edges, and held together by habits of labor, belief, storage, and command. The city's greatness is most visible in its sacred precincts, especially the areas later known to archaeologists as the Eanna precinct and the Anu district. These names come through later Mesopotamian tradition, and caution is needed when reaching backward into the 4th millennium BCE, but the archaeological remains show repeated construction, rebuilding, and monumental ambition. Buildings are razed, levelled, replaced, and razed again. Platforms lift sacred architecture above ordinary ground. Walls are decorated, spaces are planned, and the act of rebuilding itself becomes part of the city's identity. Uruk does not simply occupy the land, it thickens through time, each generation placing its structures on the compressed remains of the last. In the Anna precinct, some buildings reveal a level of planning and labour that speaks of centralised purpose. Large halls, niched facades, courtyards, and carefully arranged rooms suggest spaces meant for ceremony, administration, storage, and movement under control. The exact function of many buildings remains debated, because architecture alone cannot tell us every ritual, every rule, or every social relationship that took place inside, yet the scale is undeniable. Mud brick. Often treated as humble, becomes monumental when multiplied by thousands upon thousands of human hands. Every brick must be shaped from clay, dried in the sun, carried, stacked, repaired, and replaced. A wall is never just a wall. It is labour turned solid. One of the most striking features of Uruk's monumental architecture is how much effort goes into surfaces. Cone mosaics, made from small baked clay cones with coloured ends, are pressed into walls to create patterned decoration. These are not practical necessities. They are visual statements. They turn mud brick into something ceremonial, something shimmering with order and design. The materials are simple, but the effect would have been powerful in a world of earth tones, reed, dust, and sun. Such decoration reminds us that early urban power is not only about storage and accounting, it is also about spectacle. Institutions must be seen. Sacred spaces must impress. A city that asks thousands to work, deliver, obey, or participate must also give them images of grandeur. The Anu district, with its high terrace and long sacred history, deepens the sense that Uruk is a city built around elevated places, both physically and symbolically. The famous White Temple, usually dated later within the Uruk period, stands on a high platform that would have lifted it above the surrounding settlement. Its whitewashed surface may have caught the sunlight from far away, a bright sign against the duller colours of mud and marsh. The evidence does not allow us to reconstruct every ceremony performed there, but the message of height is clear enough. Something important stands above the ordinary city. People below can see it. They may not all enter it. Power, whether divine, human, or both, has a vertical form. Yet Uruk is not only temples. A city of such size must be crowded with ordinary life, much of it far less visible archaeologically than the great precincts. People sleep in houses built from mud brick and reed. They cook, grind grain, repair tools, shape clay, tend animals, carry water, and move through narrow passages. Children grow up among smells that would be inseparable from urban life smoke: damp earth, dung fuel, grain dust, fish, brewing beer, wool, sweat, and stagnant water. Boats arrive with goods. Workers gather for tasks. Craftspeople repeat skilled motions until production becomes almost industrial by ancient standards. Somewhere, scribes or administrators learn signs that most people may never understand. Somewhere else, a pot breaks and is swept into fill that will one day become archaeology. The density of Uruk creates new possibilities and new problems. More people mean more labour, more craft, more ritual, more trade, and more defence against scarcity. But more people also mean waste, disease, conflict, dependence, and inequality. Early cities are not clean triumphs over the village. They are experiments with crowding. Their success depends on constant movement from the countryside into the centre, and from the centre back outward grain, wool, fish, reeds, animals, labourers, finished goods, orders, obligations, and perhaps rumours. The city swallows the horizon because it draws distant fields and human lives into itself. What survives in the record suggests that Uruk's population may have reached a size unprecedented in the region, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Some estimates imagine tens of thousands of inhabitants, a staggering concentration for the 4th millennium BCE. Even if such figures are debated, the settlement's physical scale alone shows an urban phenomenon unlike earlier village life. Feeding such a place requires a hinterland. It requires farmers who may not live within the main city but whose labour sustains it. It requires storage facilities capable of absorbing surplus and releasing it in controlled ways. It requires routines strong enough to survive bad seasons and flexible enough to respond when river, crop, or politics shift. There is a lesser-known tension in this urban achievement. Uruk's power may have depended as much on its ability to attract people as to command them. Cities need migrants. They need hands for building, hauling, weaving, brewing, herding, guarding, and administration. Some people may come willingly, drawn by food, ritual prestige, work, protection, marriage, or opportunity. Others may come through obligation, dependency, or pressure from institutions that control land and rations. No single explanation fully accounts for the human flow into Uruk, but once inside the city's orbit, a person's life changes. The village world of familiar faces gives way to a wider order in which strangers become neighbours and institutions become unavoidable. Uruk's streets and precincts also create a new kind of social imagination. In a small settlement, people may know the limits of their world by walking them. In Uruk, the city itself becomes too large to grasp at once. Sacred platforms, administrative buildings, craft areas, and crowded neighbourhoods form a landscape of unequal access. Some spaces are open, others restricted. Some goods are common, others sealed away. Some people carry marks of authority, others carry baskets. The city teaches difference through movement where one may enter, where one must wait, where one delivers, where one receives, where one is counted. And still, for all its scale, Uruk remains fragile in material form. Its grandeur is made of clay. Its walls return to earth when neglected. Its buildings survive because they are rebuilt, not because they are permanent. That may be the most fitting image of the city: immense, organised, dazzling in its own way, yet always dependent on maintenance. Uruk is not a stone declaration against time. It is a living arrangement with mud, water, labour, and memory. It rises because people keep remaking it. By the time its sacred platforms shine above the plain and its administrative habits spread beyond the south, Uruk has become more than a city. It is an engine. It gathers food, people, signs, goods, and belief into one dense centre, then sends its influence outward. The forgotten empire does not need a royal inscription to show its strength. Its capital has already spoken through scale. In a world of villages, Uruk becomes a horizon of its own, a human-made landscape so large that those who enter it must feel they have stepped into the future before the future has learned how to write its name. Once Uruk has become a horizon in itself, its influence begins to appear in places far beyond the southern marshes, in landscapes that do not resemble its homeland at all. The trail leads north and west along the Euphrates, into drier plains, river valleys, and highland approaches where the world opens towards Syria and Anatolia. It also reaches eastward toward the Iranian plateau, where stone, metals, and mountain routes offer what the alluvial south cannot provide. Here, away from Uruk's great precincts and mud brick platforms, archaeologists find something both familiar and unsettling: southern-style pottery, beveled rim bowls, cylinder seals, clay ceilings, administrative habits, and buildings that seem to carry the imprint of the Uruk world into foreign ground. These distant traces are the reason the Uruk phenomenon feels larger than a city's natural influence. It is one thing for a style of pottery to spread through trade or imitation. It is another thing to find whole settlements that look, in important ways, like transplanted pieces of southern Mesopotamian life. Some sites appear to have been local communities adopting Uruk objects selectively. Others look more like enclaves, places where people connected to the Uruk world lived, worked, stored goods, and practiced familiar administrative routines far from the southern plain. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether these were colonies, trading stations, migrant neighbourhoods, seasonal outposts, or something that does not fit modern labels. But the pattern is too widespread to dismiss as coincidence. Along the Euphrates, The site of Habuba Kabira has often stood at the centre of this discussion. It lay in what is now Syria, far from Uruk itself, yet its layout and material culture show strong southern Mesopotamian characteristics. There are planned streets, walls, domestic buildings, administrative materials, and pottery that connect it to the Uruk sphere. Nearby Tel Khanas has also been discussed in relation to ritual or administrative activity. These places suggest not merely a passing caravan, but a settled presence. People from the south, or people deeply shaped by southern practices, seem to have established themselves along a major river corridor. Their purpose may have involved trade, storage, administration, and access to resources moving between regions. The location matters. Southern Mesopotamia lacks many materials that ambitious urban institutions require. It has mud, reeds, grain, fish, and date palms, but not abundant timber, stone, copper, silver, or the harder stones used for seals and prestige objects. The North and Highlands offer access to different ecological zones and resources. Timber can come from wooded regions. Metals can come from mountain zones. Stone for tools, vessels, and seals can move through exchange networks. By placing Uruk-related communities along strategic routes, the southern system may have secured the movement of goods that kept its cities alive and impressive. The forgotten empire, if that uneasy word is used, may have grown along lines of need. Yet need alone does not explain the human reality of these outposts. To imagine them only as economic stations is too narrow. People lived there. They cooked meals, repaired walls, shaped pots, carried loads, sealed containers, tended animals, and watched unfamiliar horizons. A person raised in the southern wetlands who travelled north along the Euphrates would have entered a different world, less marsh, more open dry land, different local communities, different building traditions, different foods, different dangers. The Uruk expansion was not an abstract arrow on a map. It was migration, negotiation, risk, and daily adaptation. It required people to make southern habits work in places where the environment did not always support them naturally. This is one of the lesser-known complexities of the Uruk world. Its expansion was not uniform. At some sites, Uruk material culture appears dominant. At others, it mixes with local traditions. In still other regions, local communities seem to resist, adapt, or reinterpret the incoming influence. This unevenness matters because it shows that the Uruk world was not simply pouring itself over passive landscapes. Every distant settlement existed in relation to people already there. Local elites may have welcomed Uruk connections to gain prestige, goods, or administrative tools. Local communities may have traded eagerly with southern agents. Others may have found the presence intrusive. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety of archaeological evidence. In northern Mesopotamia, places such as Brak reveal another kind of interaction. Tel Brak was already an important centre before and during the Uruk period, with its own deep local development. Uruk influence appears there, but not as if an empty land simply receives civilization from the south. Instead, the evidence suggests contact between complex societies, each with its own traditions and ambitions. This is important because older stories of civilization sometimes imagine southern Mesopotamia as the sole active source of progress. The archaeology is more interesting than that. The north was not silent. It had powerful communities, long-distance ties, and local forms of authority. Uruk's expansion entered a world already alive with complexity. This makes the Uruk phenomenon look less like a simple empire and more like a web of contact zones. In some places, southern people may have lived in distinct quarters. In others, local and southern practices blended. Trade goods moved, but so did habits, sealing containers, counting goods, using standardized bowls, organizing storage, displaying authority through cylinder seals, building in recognizable forms. These practices could be useful even to people outside Uruk's direct control. Administration travels well because it solves problems. If a local leader wants to manage goods, impress rivals, or participate in wider exchange, Uruk methods may offer ready-made tools. But tools are never neutral. A sealing system changes how goods are trusted. Standardized containers change how rations or commodities are distributed. Imported prestige objects change status competition. A foreign enclave changes local politics simply by existing. Even without armies, the Uruk world could create pressure. Communities connected to its network may gain advantages over those outside it. Local leaders who adopt its methods may become stronger. People who control access to southern goods may gain influence. The expansion of Uruk is therefore not only commercial, it is social and political, even when its violence, if any, remains archaeologically hard to see. The outposts also reveal the fragility of distance. A colony or trading station depends on routes remaining open, relations staying manageable, supplies arriving, and local conditions remaining favourable. If the home city weakens, if demand changes, if local communities resist, if climate or river routes shift, the distant settlement becomes vulnerable. Some Uruk-related sites appear to have been occupied for relatively short periods. Their remains suggest intensity rather than permanence. They flare into the record and then fade, leaving behind walls, pottery, seals, and questions. Still, during their time, these settlements extend Uruk's reach across a remarkable area. They show that before the classic age of named empires, people were already building long-distance systems of influence. They were not merely trading occasional luxuries from one village to another. They were establishing nodes, routines, and administrative practices that linked distant landscapes to the needs of early cities. Goods flowed toward the south. Ideas moved in both directions. People carried memories of one place into another. The world was becoming connected in ways that would shape everything after it. So the forgotten empire beneath history is not found only in Uruk's sacred precincts. It is also found in a southern-style bowl discovered far from the marshes, in a seal impression on a lump of clay beside the Euphrates, in a planned settlement standing where local and foreign worlds meet, in the quiet evidence that people before written history already understood the power of distance. Uruk's rule, if rule is the right word, stretches not as a single border, but as a chain of places where clay, grain, timber, metal, and authority move together. The city that swallowed the horizon has begun to plant pieces of itself beyond sight of its own towers. The routes that carried Uruk outward are older than the empires that later make roads famous. They are not paved imperial highways with milestones, guards, and royal stations. They are river corridors, marsh channels, desert margins, mountain passes, seasonal tracks, and remembered paths between communities that know where water can be found and where strangers may be dangerous. Long before written treaties describe trade, objects are already moving across astonishing distances. A dark stone suitable for a seal, a lump of copper ore, a plank of timber, a jar of oil, a bundle of wool, a basket of grain, a block of bitumen, a shell, a bead, a tool, a story, a technique, a rumour of wealth, all of them can travel farther than most human lives. Southern Mesopotamia's greatest weakness becomes one of the reasons for its reach. The low plain can feed cities, but it cannot furnish them completely. Mud brick can raise walls, but not carve durable sculpture. Reeds can roof houses, but not replace strong beams from mountain forests. Clay can be shaped into tablets, bowls, and ceilings. But the small stones used for cylinder seals must often come from elsewhere. Copper, silver, hard stone, and good timber all lie beyond the marshes and fields. A society that grows large in the south must therefore become skilled at connection. It must reach north toward Anatolia, east toward the Zagros and Iranian plateau, west through Syria, and south along water routes that may eventually connect to the Gulf. What survives in the record suggests that Uruk's power is inseparable from this hunger for distant materials. The Euphrates is one of the great arteries. Its course links southern Mesopotamia with northern regions and Syrian plains, carrying boats, goods, and people through landscapes that change gradually from wet alluvium to drier steppe. Movement by river is easier than dragging heavy loads across land, but it is never effortless. Boats must be built, loaded, poled, sailed, hauled, or guided through shifting channels. River levels change, sandbanks appear. Local communities control stretches of passage. A cargo moving along the river is not just travelling through geography, it is passing through zones of negotiation. Every landing place can be an opportunity or a threat. Land routes are more demanding still. Pack animals, human porters, sledges, and carts move goods across dry ground, but their range depends on water, fodder, weather, and security. The donkey, domesticated earlier in the Near East, becomes increasingly important in long-distance exchange, though reconstructing the exact role of pack transport in the Uruk expansion remains difficult. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the balance between river traffic, overland caravans, and local relay exchange. It is unlikely that every object travelled in one dramatic journey from source to city. Many goods probably moved through chains of exchange, passing from one community to another, gaining value and meaning as they moved. That chain matters because trade before empire is not only economic, it is social. A trader or emissary cannot simply appear in a foreign settlement and expect trust. Relationships must be maintained. Gifts may be exchanged. Marriages, ritual obligations, host arrangements, shared feasts, debts, and repeated visits may all help goods move safely. Seals and clay records assist administration, but human trust still carries the root. The Forgotten Empire's network is therefore both practical and personal. Behind every imported stone lies someone who knew where to obtain it, someone who agreed to release it, someone who transported it, and someone who received it into an institutional system that could turn distant matter into local power. Some materials reveal this web especially well. Bitumen, a natural asphalt found in various parts of the Near East, is used for waterproofing boats, sealing containers, and binding materials. It is not glamorous, but it is essential in a waterlogged world. Without waterproofing, boats and baskets fail. With it, marsh and river transport become more reliable. Copper, whether traded as ore, ingots, or finished objects, opens another world of tools, status, and craft. Hard stones used for seals allow officials or elites to carry identity and authority in miniature. Even humble-looking materials become part of Uruk's political life once they enter controlled systems of production and redistribution. Prestige goods carry a different kind of force. Exotic stones, shells, metals, and finely made objects do more than satisfy taste. They create visible difference. Someone who controls access to distant materials can mark status, reward allies, impress dependents, and participate in rituals that link wealth with sacred authority. A cylinder seal carved from imported stone is not just an administrative tool. It is an object that says its owner belongs to a world larger than the local field. In a society where many people live within ration systems and routine labour, such objects help define who stands closer to the centre of power. Yet trade is not a simple story of Uruk taking what it wants from passive neighbours. Northern and highland communities have their own interests. They may control access to resources that the south needs badly. They may bargain from strength. They may imitate Uruk styles for local reasons, reject them, transform them, or use contact with Uruk to strengthen their own leaders. No single explanation fully accounts for the many regional responses visible in archaeology. The exchange network is not a straight line from centre to edge. It is a field of unequal but active participants, all adjusting to the opportunities and dangers created by early urban demand. The demand itself may have reshaped landscapes far beyond Uruk. Timber extraction changes forests, metal procurement changes mountain communities. Increased production of textiles requires wool, labour, animals, and grazing land. Grain moving into cities binds rural fields to urban mouths. Even if direct evidence is patchy, the logic of scale is clear. A large city does not consume only what lies at its walls. It reaches outward invisibly through every object it requires. The city's true footprint is larger than its built area. It includes pastures, canals, quarries, forests, mines, workshops, ports, and paths where people may never see Uruk but still feel its pull. There is a quiet danger in such dependence. The more a city relies on distant materials, the more vulnerable it becomes to disruption. A broken alliance, a hostile local power, a failed harvest, a blocked river route, a shift in demand, or unrest in an outpost can ripple through the system. Complexity creates abundance, but also exposure. The Uruk world's trade routes are therefore not merely signs of strength. They are lines of need stretched across uncertain landscapes. By following these routes, the Forgotten Empire becomes easier to imagine not as a territory, but as circulation. Grain moves one way, stone another, seals mark goods, boats carry jars, pack animals cross dry ground. Local leaders calculate advantage, administrators count arrivals, craftspeople transform raw materials into objects of use and prestige. The city at the southern end grows larger, brighter, and more demanding. Its reach is measured not only in miles, but in dependencies. Before empires have names, before kings boast of roads and tribute, Uruk is already discovering that power belongs to those who can make distant places feed a single centre's appetite. Behind the roots, seals, temples, and monumental walls stands the more difficult reality of Uruk the city is made out of human days. Every canal cleared, every brick carried, every bowl shaped, every ration measured, every jar sealed, every field harvested. Every boat unloaded belongs to someone's body before it belongs to archaeology. The Forgotten Empire can be traced through objects, but it is powered by lives that rarely leave names. The first cities do not rise simply because ideas become more complex. They rise because thousands of people accept, endure, resist, or depend upon new routines of labour. Urban civilization is not only a triumph of organisation, it is also an immense rearrangement of ordinary time. For the farmer on the edge of Uruk's hinterland, the city may appear less as a distant wonder than as a demand. Fields must feed more than the household. Grain may be owed to institutions that store, redistribute, and record it. Irrigation work pulls people away from their own plots. Harvest seasons become moments of intense pressure, because failure no longer affects only one family or village. A city concentrates hunger. Its people cannot all grow their own food. They depend on fields beyond the walls, and those fields depend on coordinated water. What survives in the record suggests that rural labour and urban authority become tightly bound, though the exact terms of that relationship remain difficult to reconstruct. For the worker inside the city, life may be shaped by rations. The beveled rim bowl, plain and often carelessly made, becomes one of the most haunting symbols of this world because it may represent food measured out to anonymous labourers. If this interpretation is correct, then the bowl is both support and control. It feeds the person who receives it. but it also marks that person's place within an institutional system. A ration is not a feast. It is calculated survival. It says that labour has been recognised, but also that food comes through channels someone else manages. No single explanation fully accounts for all such bowls, yet their abundance still points toward a society where standardised provisioning plays a large role. The work itself is heavy. Mud brick construction begins in the body feet mixing clay and straw, hands shaping bricks, backs bending to lift them, shoulders carrying loads under the heat. A single monumental building requires unimaginable repetition. Brick after brick after brick, each one small enough to seem insignificant, together becoming walls, terraces, platforms, and precincts. Canal labour is equally demanding. Silt must be cleared, banks repaired, channels reopened after floods, and water guided before the crop suffers. These tasks are not glamorous, and they are not optional. The city's grandeur rests on maintenance. Civilization survives because someone is always repairing the conditions that allow it to exist. Women's labour, though often less visible in the archaeological record, is central to this world. Textile production becomes one of the great industries of Mesopotamian life, and later texts make clear how important weaving, spinning, and wool processing become to temple and palace economies. For the Uruk period, the evidence remains incomplete, but it is reasonable to infer that cloth production already requires significant organised labour. Wool must be cleaned, spun, dyed or prepared, woven, stored and exchanged. Beer brewing, food preparation, childcare, grinding grain, tending household spaces, and processing raw materials all sustain the larger system. The city's public monuments may dominate the excavated imagination, but much of its true strength lies in repetitive domestic and workshop labour. There is a surprising detail hidden in the ordinary diet of early urban workers. Beer is not a luxury in the later sense, but a staple of nourishment, payment, and social life. In Mesopotamia, beer made from barley becomes deeply woven into daily existence. It provides calories, uses grain in a durable and drinkable form, and appears later in administrative texts as part of ration systems. The exact practices of the Uruk period cannot be read as clearly as later records, but the deep association between barley, brewing, labour, and institutional distribution almost certainly has early roots. A worker's day may be measured not only by bread and grain, but by beer thick with nutrition and tied to obligation. Craft specialists live within another kind of discipline. The potter repeats forms until hands know the shape before thought begins. The seal cutter works at a tiny scale, carving images into hard stone that may authorize goods far beyond his own social rank. The metalworker depends on materials from distant lands and knowledge that must be learned through practice. The boat builder understands reeds, wood, bitumen, balance, and current. These people possess skills that make the city possible. Yet skill does not always mean freedom. Some may work independently, others may be attached to institutions. Scholars still debate how much early Uruk production was centrally controlled and how much remained household-based or flexible. The likely answer is uneven, changing, and difficult to force into one model. Urban life also changes the experience of strangers. In a village, most faces are familiar, and reputation travels quickly. In Uruk, a person encounters people from different neighbourhoods, occupations, kin groups, and perhaps distant regions. Migrants arrive from smaller settlements. Traders come with foreign materials. Administrators deal with workers they may not know personally. The city creates anonymity, and anonymity requires new forms of trust and control, seals, records, ration systems. Spatial restrictions and institutional routines all help manage a world where personal memory is no longer enough. To live in the first city is to live among people one cannot fully know. This creates possibilities as well as hardship. The city offers access to rituals on a scale no village can match. It offers goods from distant places, skilled crafts, protective institutions, marriage networks, work, food distribution, and participation in something larger than the household. For some, Uruk may have been attractive, even dazzling. A young person from a small settlement might see its platforms, crowds, workshops, and ceremonies as a new world of opportunity. For others, the same city may have felt like dependency made visible in mud brick and sealed storerooms. The evidence cannot preserve their feelings, but it allows us to see the conditions that might produce both awe and exhaustion. Disease and crowding are part of the cost. Large populations living close together, with animals, waste, standing water, insects, and stored grain, create new health risks. Early cities are not sanitary in a modern sense. They concentrate not only labour and wealth, but also infection, pests, and vulnerability to shortages. Skeletal evidence from early urban populations in different regions often suggests that the rise of agriculture and urban density brought nutritional stress and disease burdens, though each site must be interpreted carefully. Uruk's success may have carried biological costs that no monument records. Civilization makes many things possible, but it does not automatically make life easier. Inequality sharpens the burden. Some people hold seals, others receive rations. Some enter restricted buildings, others deliver goods to their doors. Some control records, others become entries within them. The difference may not yet appear as the extravagant royal wealth of later ages, but the foundations of hierarchy are present. Power is becoming institutional, and institutional power has a way of outliving the individuals who serve it. A person can die, but the storeroom continues. A worker can be replaced, but the ration system remains. A family can suffer, but the city still needs grain. And yet, it would be too simple to reduce the first city to exploitation. Uruk is also a collective achievement. Its people build something no earlier generation has seen at this scale. They create new forms of memory, craft, movement, ceremony, and exchange. They learn to make a human landscape dense enough to alter history. The human cost is real, but so is the human genius. The Forgotten Empire is not built by abstract forces. It is built by tired hands, trained eyes, bent backs, skilled fingers, anxious households, ambitious elites, careful administrators, and workers whose names vanish while their labour remains. Beneath every broken bowl and every mud brick wall, there is a life spent inside the first great experiment of the city. The deeper Uruk's world extends, the more difficult its power becomes to define. A later empire can often be followed through destruction layers, fortified borders, garrison towns, royal inscriptions, tribute lists, and the names of conquered peoples. Uruk leaves a subtler trail. Its pottery appears far from home. Its administrative tools appear in distant settlements. Its bowls, seals, ceilings, and building styles cross into regions with their own older traditions. Sometimes the evidence looks like settlement, sometimes it looks like trade, sometimes it looks like imitation, sometimes it looks like control. The mystery is not whether Uruk influenced a vast area. The mystery is how that influence worked, and what kind of power could spread so widely before the age of written political history. One explanation begins with peaceful exchange. Southern Mesopotamia needs what it does not possess: timber, metals, stone, and access to highland resources. The north and surrounding regions need or desire southern goods, textiles, grain products, crafted objects, administrative methods, or the prestige of connection with a large urban centre. In this view, The Uruk expansion is not an empire in the military sense, but a commercial and cultural network, traders, migrants, and local elites carry objects and habits across distance because those objects and habits are useful. A cylinder seal helps manage goods. A standardized vessel helps organize distribution. A Southern-style object signals participation in a wider world. Influence spreads because people choose to adopt it. There is strength in this explanation. Not every distant Uruk-style object requires conquest. Trade can move styles quickly. People imitate powerful centers without being forced. Local leaders may borrow foreign practices to strengthen their own position. A small community on a trade route might find advantage in using Uruk administrative tools because those tools help it deal with southern merchants or institutions. Cultural influence can be persuasive, especially when attached to wealth. Scale and ritual prestige. The evidence remains incomplete, but much of the Uruk world spread looks too varied, too locally adapted to be explained by a single campaign of domination. Yet peaceful exchange alone may be too soft a picture. Some Uruk-related settlements beyond the southern heartland look planned and intrusive enough to suggest organized colonization. At places such as Habuba Kabira, the material culture does not appear merely as a few imported objects sprinkled into a local village. It suggests a stronger southern presence, perhaps even communities founded by people connected to Uruk. These settlements may have served as nodes for trade, storage, administration, and resource movement. If so, Uruk's expansion was not only about influence drifting outward, it involved people physically placing themselves in strategic landscapes, building familiar spaces in unfamiliar territory, and tying distant routes more directly to southern needs. This raises the possibility of early colonial power, though the word must be used carefully. There is no clear evidence of Uruk armies conquering large territories in the way later empires do. No surviving royal inscription claims victory over these lands. No written governor announces his appointment, but colonialism does not always begin with armies. It can begin with settlement, economic dependency, control of exchange routes, and the insertion of foreign institutions into local worlds. An Uruk enclave could alter nearby societies even without open warfare. It could redirect trade, empower certain local partners, compete with existing centers, and create new inequalities. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but the possibility cannot be dismissed simply because the evidence is not dramatic. Another explanation looks inward, toward resource pressure. As Uruk grows, its appetite grows with it. Large urban institutions require a steady flow of materials. More people need more food, more fuel, more tools, more containers, more textiles, more building supplies, more prestige goods, and more administrative control. The southern plain can support dense populations, but only through constant management, and it lacks many essentials. Expansion may therefore have been driven by necessity. A city that cannot obtain timber, metals, and stone locally must extend its reach or accept limits on its growth. In this view, the Uruk system expands because the city's own success creates demands that local ecology cannot meet. This does not mean Uruk was starving for resources in a simple sense. Rather, it means complexity generates hunger. A village can live with few imported goods. A city with temples, workshops, elites, administrators, rituals, and long-distance ambitions cannot. Once certain forms of wealth and authority depend on foreign materials, the system must keep those materials moving. Resource pressure becomes political pressure. Control over trade routes becomes control over the future of the city. The farther Uruk reaches, the more it reveals its own dependence. A different explanation emphasizes migration. People from southern Mesopotamia may have moved outward for many reasons: trade, work, administrative service, opportunity, land pressure, conflict, or institutional assignment. They may have founded settlements, married locally, joined existing communities, or lived in distinct enclaves. Their movement would carry pottery habits, foodways, sealing practices, building techniques, and social expectations. Migration explains why some distant sites feel strongly southern without requiring a centralized imperial command. People carry worlds inside their hands. A potter makes the vessels he knows. An administrator seals goods in the manner he was taught. A household arranges space according to familiar habits. A foreign landscape gradually acquires southern traces. Religious prestige may also play a role. Uruk's monumental precincts and sacred institutions may have radiated authority beyond economic power. In early societies, ritual centers can attract offerings, pilgrims, labor, and imitation. A city that appears favored by the gods, or skilled at mediating divine order, may become influential in ways difficult to measure archaeologically. A distant community might adopt Uruk practices not only because they help count grain, but because they connect local authority to a powerful sacred style. Scholars still debate how much religion drove the expansion, partly because ritual meaning is difficult to reconstruct from material remains alone. Still, in a world where temple, storage, labor, and divine order overlap, economics and religion cannot be pulled apart cleanly. There is also the possibility of competition among elites. Uruk may not have been a single unified state acting with one will. Instead, different institutions, households, temples, or factions may have competed for access to resources and prestige. Expansion could have emerged from many overlapping ambitions rather than a single plan. One group sends traders north, another sponsors a distant settlement, another controls a workshop dependent on imported stone, another strengthens ties with the local highland community. From a distance, all this appears as the Uruk expansion. Up close, it may have been a patchwork of rival projects carried forward by people who did not think of themselves as agents of one empire. This may be the most realistic picture, not one cause, but many forces reinforcing one another. Trade opens routes, migration carries habits, resource needs intensify contact, religious prestige gives southern forms symbolic weight, local elites adapt what benefits them. Southern institutions try to secure supplies. Some communities welcome the connection, others resist or remain outside it. The Uruk world becomes powerful precisely because it is flexible. It can appear as a merchant's seal. A settler's house, a temple's demand, a bowl in a worker's hand, a local imitation, or a planned outpost near a strategic river. The mystery of control therefore remains unresolved because Uruk's power may not have been one thing. It may have been a system before systems were named, an empire-like network without the later language of empire. It could dominate through appetite, attraction, habit, dependency, and administration more than through banners and conquest. That makes it harder to see, but not less important. The forgotten empire ruled, if it ruled, by making itself useful, desirable, and difficult to avoid. Its greatest weapon may not have been the sword, it may have been the sealed jar, the ration bowl, the distant settlement, the counted flock, and the quiet understanding that to trade with Uruk was also to enter its order. A system as wide as Uruk's does not have to shatter in a single dramatic moment to begin falling apart. Sometimes collapse begins quietly, at the edges, where distance is already difficult and loyalty is more practical than emotional. A settlement is abandoned, a trade route loses importance. A storeroom no longer receives the goods it was built to manage. Local pottery returns where southern forms once dominated. An outpost that once looked like a transplanted piece of Zuruk life is left to weather, its walls slowly softening back toward earth. No inscription explains the decision. No defeated ruler records the loss. The network begins to fray in the same way it was woven through many small actions, repeated across landscapes until a vast pattern changes. The end of the Uruk expansion remains one of the more intriguing problems in early Near Eastern archaeology. By the late 4th millennium BCE, many Uruk-related colonies and enclaves outside the southern heartland decline or disappear. Sites along the Euphrates that once carried strong southern traits are abandoned. In northern Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, local traditions reassert themselves more visibly. The material signs of Uruk influence do not vanish everywhere at once, and southern Mesopotamia itself continues to develop. But the broad outward system loses coherence. What survives in the record suggests not a simple destruction, but a retreat, transformation, or unravelling whose causes remain debated. One possibility is that distance finally becomes too expensive. The Uruk network depends on movement goods moving south, administrative habits moving outward, people maintaining settlements far from home, routes remaining open through regions filled with the local interests. Such a system can be powerful when conditions favour it, but it is costly to sustain. A distant colony needs food, labour, protection, relationships with neighbours, and continuing reason to exist. If the materials it helps obtain can be acquired through other channels, if local resistance grows, if southern demand shifts, or if the home institutions face strain, the outpost becomes vulnerable. The edge of a network is often where weakness appears first. Local resistance may have played a role, though it rarely leaves a clear signature. Communities in northern Syria, Anatolia, Iran, and northern Mesopotamia were not empty recipients of southern influence. They had their own leaders, traditions, economies, and sacred landscapes. An Uruk enclave might bring opportunity, but also disruption. It could redirect trade, concentrate advantage, alter local hierarchies, or introduce unfamiliar administrative demands. Some local elites may have benefited from Uruk contact, while others lost influence. Over time, communities may have chosen to push back, absorb what was useful, and reject what was not. The evidence remains incomplete, but the uneven decline of Uruk presence suggests that local agency mattered. Environmental strain is another part of the story, though it must be handled carefully. Ancient climate and river systems are complex, and no single environmental explanation fully accounts for the end of the Uruk expansion. Still, the late 4th millennium BCE was not a static world. River channels shift, flood patterns change, marshes expand or contract. Agricultural soils can become stressed by irrigation, especially when salinity builds over time. Droughts or changing rainfall patterns in northern regions may have affected routes and settlements. Even modest environmental pressures can become serious when societies depend on long chains of supply. A village can adapt locally. A vast network must adapt everywhere at once. The southern heartland may also have been changing internally. Uruk's growth creates its own problems: population density, food demand, labour organisation, competition between institutions, and the need to maintain canals and storage systems. As cities become larger and more complex, their politics may become more unstable. Institutions that once pushed outward may turn inward. Rival centres in southern Mesopotamia may begin to matter more. Regional competition could draw energy away from distant colonies. Scholars still debate the political structure of the Uruk world precisely because the evidence does not name its rulers clearly, but it is possible that the system was never centralized enough to manage a long crisis as one body. There is also the possibility that the Uruk expansion succeeded so well that its original form became unnecessary. Administrative tools, sealing practices, and certain styles may have spread into local societies, where they were adapted and transformed. Once local communities learned to use parts of the Uruk package for their own purposes, They may no longer have needed direct southern presence. Influence can outlive control. A foreign method becomes local. A borrowed form becomes familiar. The colony fades, but the habit remains. In that sense, the retreat of Uruk does not necessarily mean failure. It may mark the moment when a network stops looking southern because its innovations have been absorbed by others. The archaeology of abandonment is always haunting because it records decisions without voices. A house is left with objects still inside, or carefully emptied before departure. A wall falls because no one repairs it. A storage system stops receiving goods. A workshop grows silent. At some sites, abandonment may have been planned and orderly. At others, sudden or stressful. The difference matters, but it is not always easy to read after 5,000 years. Mud brick ruins collapse into mounds. Pottery scatters. Later occupations disturb earlier layers. The record preserves the outline of change, but not the last conversation before a family leaves, not the final order given by an administrator, not the fear or relief of people watching a distant settlement dissolve. The decline of the Uruk network also reminds us that early complexity does not move in a straight line. It is tempting to imagine civilization as steady progress: village, town, city, empire, writing, law, state. The real pattern is more unstable. Systems grow, experiment, overreach, adapt, and sometimes contract. The Uruk world creates cities of astonishing scale, long-distance networks, administrative technologies, and new forms of social power. Then its outward reach weakens. Some settlements disappear, some regions turn back toward local styles. The centre does not simply conquer the future, it leaves behind a changed world, but it does not remain unchanged itself. In this fraying, the forgotten empire becomes even more mysterious. If it had fallen in a spectacular war, the story might feel easier. If fire layers marked every colony, if skeletons filled the streets, if a later king boasted of destroying Uruk's outposts, collapse would have a sharper shape. Instead, the evidence suggests something more human and more common: a system losing its balance through many pressures at once. Distance, local resistance, environmental uncertainty, internal strain. Shifting trade and transformation of borrowed practices may all have contributed. The unravelling is not one event, but a process. Yet the end of the network is not the end of Uruk's legacy. The outposts fade, but the ideas do not. Accounting remains, seals remain, urban life remains. Southern Mesopotamia continues toward the age of written city-states, named rulers, rival temples, and histories that finally speak more clearly from clay. The first great expansion before history withdraws into silence. But it has already done its work. It has shown that a city can reach far beyond its walls, that administration can bind distant places, and that power can spread through need as much as conquest. When the network frays, it does not erase the pattern. It leaves threads buried across the ancient Near East, waiting for archaeologists to notice that before the famous empires, another order had already risen, stretched outward, and quietly come apart. After the outward network weakens, southern Mesopotamia does not fall silent. The retreat of Uruk's distant influence is not the end of civilization in the south, but a change in its shape. The great experiment has left behind cities, institutions, administrative habits, and social expectations that cannot simply be undone. People do not forget how to count grain because a colony on the Euphrates has been abandoned. They do not stop building temples because a trade route has shifted. They do not return easily to a world where every obligation can be remembered by kinship alone. Uruk's expansion may fray, but the urban idea remains, and in the centuries after its widest reach, that idea begins to take on new local forms. This is the long threshold between the Uruk world and the later Sumerian city-states. It is a period that can feel dim because later names are still only beginning to emerge clearly, and the record remains uneven. Archaeologists speak of phases and material cultures, of pottery styles, settlement patterns, tablets, seals, and architectural change, while the people themselves mostly remain anonymous. Yet the darkness is not emptiness. What survives in the record suggests a landscape reorganizing after a huge wave of earlier expansion. The broad Uruk system no longer dominates distant regions as before, but in southern Mesopotamia, cities continue to grow, compete, adapt, and refine the tools that will define early history. One major consequence of the Uruk age is that the city becomes normal. That may sound simple, but it is one of the most important changes human beings ever make. Before the 4th millennium BCE, large urban life is exceptional, experimental, and strange. After Uruk, it becomes a model that can be repeated. Settlements such as Nippur, Kish, Lagash, and others will eventually become part of the famous Sumerian world, each with its own gods, institutions, rulers, fields, canals, rivalries, and memories. Not all of this later development can be credited to Uruk alone, and scholars still debate the exact paths by which early city-states formed, but Uruk proves that dense urban society can exist in the southern plain, and that proof changes the future. The political landscape may become more fragmented. If the earlier Uruk phenomenon was a wide cultural and economic system centered strongly on one great urban force, the later world appears increasingly filled with multiple competing centers. Each city draws strength from its own hinterland. Each controls fields, canals, labor, temples, and storage. Each develops identities tied to local gods and sacred places. Power becomes more local, but not simpler. Instead of one broad Uruk horizon, the south begins to resemble a constellation of urban powers, close enough to influence each other, ambitious enough to compete, and dependent enough on shared water systems that conflict and cooperation are never far apart. This shift towards city-states may have been shaped by the very success of urbanization. Once several cities grow large, no single center can easily absorb all authority without resistance. Canals create connections, but also disputes. Fields have boundaries. Temples have interests. Local elites have ambitions. Labor and grain can be counted, but people do not become passive simply because records exist. The late 4th and early 3rd millennium BCE world is likely filled with negotiation. Between temple households and emerging rulers, between cities and villages, between farmers and administrators, between old ritual authority and newer forms of political leadership. The evidence remains incomplete, but the later Sumerian pattern of rival cities may have roots in this post-Uruk rebalancing. Writing also changes during this long aftermath. What begins as proto-writing for administration gradually moves toward fuller systems capable of recording language more clearly. This does not happen overnight, and the early tablets remain difficult, technical, and often narrow in subject. But the direction is unmistakable. Signs become more standardized. Scribal traditions develop. Administrative records multiply and eventually open the way to lexical lists. Names, titles, offerings, land records, and later literary and royal texts. The first written history does not suddenly appear as a complete voice. It grows out of accounting, training, repetition, and institutional need. Before stories can be preserved, scribes must learn how signs behave. This is one of the strange ironies of the Forgotten Empire. Uruk itself belongs largely to the world before readable history, yet it helps create the tools by which later history becomes readable. Its early administrators may not have intended to invent a new human relationship with time. They needed to manage goods. They needed to remember quantities. They needed proof that something had been delivered, sealed, owed, or consumed. But from those practical pressures comes a scribal tradition that will eventually record myths, hymns, disputes, laws, royal victories, school exercises, and laments for ruined cities. The voice of Mesopotamia grows out of the silence of storage rooms. The older temple-centered world also evolves. In later Sumerian cities, temples remain powerful, but kingship becomes more visible. Rulers begin to appear with names, titles, inscriptions, and claims to divine favor. The exact relationship between earlier priestly or institutional authority and later kingship is still debated. It would be too simple to say that priest-kings turn directly into monarchs, as if society follows a neat ladder. What survives in the record suggests a more complicated process. Military leadership, canal management, temple patronage, elite competition, and control over labor may all contribute to the rise of named rulers. But once kingship becomes legible, it inherits a world that Uruk helped prepare cities already organized, labor already mobilized, records already meaningful, temples already central, and people already accustomed to living under institutions larger than themselves. Regional cultures outside the south also move on. In northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and Iran, communities that once interacted with Uruk continue along their own paths. Some retain elements of administrative practice or material style. Others emphasize local traditions. The end of direct Uruk influence may have allowed regional identities to strengthen. This is not a simple retreat into isolation. Contact continues across the ancient Near East, but the balance changes. The world after Uruk is not less connected. It is connected differently. The older network has loosened, and many centers begin to shape their own futures from the tools, memories, and pressures left behind. For ordinary people, this transition is probably less visible as a grand historical shift than as changes in obligation and belonging. A family may still plant barley near a canal. A worker may still receive rations. A potter may still shape vessels for local demand. A temple may still dominate the skyline. But the authority demanding labor may now be more distinctly tied to a local city. The stories told about gods may become more particular. The conflicts over water may involve neighboring urban centers rather than distant colonies. The world grows more politically divided even as its underlying habits remain deeply Uruk-like. In this sense, Uruk does not vanish after its network phrase. It dissolves into the foundations of what follows. Its empire-like reach contracts, but its inventions spread downward into the soil of history. The later Sumerian world, with its rival cities, temple economies, scribal schools, rulers, myths, and administrative brilliance, does not emerge from nowhere. It rises from a landscape already transformed by the first great urban age. The forgotten empire gives way to remembered kingdoms, but it does so by making them possible. What remains of the Uruk world is not a story laid open, but a room full of fragments, a broken tablet, a seal impression, a collapsed wall, a scatter of pottery, a floor rebuilt over an older floor, a grave disturbed by time, a deserted settlement on a river bank, a temple platform rising through layers of mud, brick, and ash. Each piece seems to speak, but never enough. The forgotten empire survives as evidence without confession. It shows that something vast happened, that people organized labor, counted goods, built cities, crossed long distances, and changed the structure of human life. Yet the record refuses to say exactly how they understood themselves, what names they gave their power, what fears moved them, and what arguments filled the spaces between command and obedience. This is why archaeology is both powerful and humbling. It can recover patterns invisible to memory. It can show that Uruk influence reached distant regions long before written histories describe such movements. It can trace pottery styles across landscapes, compare building plans, analyze clay ceilings, map settlement sizes, identify craft production, and reconstruct parts of ancient economies from objects once considered rubbish. But archaeology cannot simply resurrect the past whole. Every excavation cuts into a damaged archive, mud brick melts, organic materials decay, later builders destroy earlier layers, looters disturb graves, water tables rise. Old notes from early excavations may be incomplete by modern standards. The evidence remains incomplete, and every reconstruction must carry that uncertainty inside it. The tablets are among the most frustrating witnesses. They are precious because they preserve the earlier steps toward writing. Yet many of them do not tell stories. They count, classify, and administer. They refer to commodities, numbers, officials, institutions, or categories that scholars can sometimes identify and sometimes only guess at. Proto-cuneiform signs do not always correspond neatly to later writing. Some signs change meaning. Some remain obscure. Some tablets are broken at exactly the wrong place. A record may show that something was delivered, but not why it mattered. It may preserve a transaction, but not the human relationship behind it. The clay remembers the count, not the conversation. Seals and sealings are equally revealing and equally evasive. A cylinder seal can show authority, identity, and imagery compressed into a small object, but its scenes are not captions. Animals, figures, processions, offerings, and symbolic arrangements may hint at ritual or hierarchy. Yet interpretation is difficult. The so-called priest-king figure may represent a ruler, a ritual specialist, an elite role, or an idealized image of authority. Scholars still debate such meanings because visual power does not always translate across 5,000 years. A seal impression can tell us that goods were secured or a door was closed, but not whether the act was routine, tense, sacred, corrupt, or feared. Pottery creates another kind of puzzle. Archaeologists often depend on pottery because it survives in abundance and changes through time in recognizable ways. Uruk-style vessels found far from southern Mesopotamia help define the expansion itself, but pottery alone cannot explain the social meaning of its presence. A southern-style bowl in a northern settlement might belong to migrants from Uruk. Local imitation, trade exchange, administrative practice, or a mixed community where identity is more complicated than categories allow. A familiar shape can travel without a person. A person can travel without preserving every custom. A local potter can imitate a foreign form for reasons that never enter the record. No single explanation fully accounts for every distribution of material culture. Architecture seems more solid, but even buildings resist simple answers. A monumental structure tells us that labour was organised, that some institution had authority, and that public or sacred space mattered. It does not always reveal whether the building was a temple, administrative hall, storage facility, ceremonial platform, elite residence, or some combination of these. Modern labels can divide functions that ancient people experienced together. A place of worship may also store grain. A place of storage may also express sacred power. A courtyard used for ritual may also regulate access to goods. The ruins preserve walls, but not the full logic of use. Graves should, in theory, bring us closer to individuals, but even they speak unevenly. Burial practices can reveal status, diet, health, violence, migration, and belief. Yet the Uruk world does not hand over a simple map of its society through tombs. Some burials are disturbed, some are modest, some are missing from excavated areas, and some social differences may not have been expressed through grave wealth, in ways archaeologists can easily detect. A poor burial does not always mean an unimportant life. A rich object does not always mean political command. Death leaves evidence, but living society decides what death displays. Abandoned sites add another layer of silence. When an Uruk-related settlement beyond the south is deserted, the temptation is to make the event dramatic invasion, revolt, drought, collapse. Sometimes such things may have happened, yet abandonment can also be gradual, planned, seasonal, economic, or administrative. People may leave because a route changes, a local alliance fails, a resource loses value, or a distant institution no longer supports the settlement. They may carry away what matters most and leave behind only broken things. Archaeology sees the absence after departure, not always the reason for leaving. The last day of a site is rarely preserved as clearly as imagination wants it to be. Even scientific methods, powerful as they are, do not remove uncertainty completely. Radiocarbon dates provide ranges, not exact diary entries. Soil analysis can suggest environmental conditions, but not always human decisions. Residue analysis may identify what a vessel once held, but not who used it or under what circumstances. Isotopes can hint at movement and diet. Ancient DNA, when available, can illuminate ancestry and mobility, though preservation in hot. Difficult environments can be poor. Each method sharpens part of the image, yet the full picture remains assembled from overlapping probabilities. This is why the Uruk world remains so compelling. It stands at the edge between prehistory and history, between material pattern and readable voice. There is enough evidence to know that it transformed the ancient Near East, but not enough to reduce it to a simple story. It may have been an empire, a network, a colonial system, a cultural horizon, an economic expansion, a religious sphere, or all of these at once in different places. The ruins refuse the comfort of a single answer. They demand patience, and perhaps that is fitting. The people of Uruk did not build their world so that distant observers could understand it easily. They built to store grain, honor gods, organize work, secure goods, feed dependents, impress rivals, and survive in a demanding landscape. Their traces are practical because their lives were practical. What they leave behind is not a finished narrative, but the machinery of existence. Broken tablets, sealed clay, worn floors, ordinary bowls, and collapsed walls become the language of a civilization that still speaks mostly in fragments. To listen to it, one must accept that some of its greatest truths remain buried not because they are hidden by mystery alone, but because time has taken away the voices that once made them clear. The ruins refuse to give Uruk a simple ending, but they make one thing clear: the world that comes after it is not the same world that came before. Even if its outward network contracts, even if its distant settlements fade, even if its own rulers remain unnamed or uncertain, Uruk has already changed the grammar of civilization. It teaches human beings how to live at a scale once unimaginable. It turns the city from an accident of growth into a durable form of power. It shows that grain, labor, ritual, storage, accounting, craft, and distance can be bound together into a system strong enough to reshape regions far beyond its own walls. Its empire, if that difficult word is used, survives less as territory than as method. The most obvious legacy is urban life itself. Uruk proves that the southern Mesopotamian plain can support a city of extraordinary size, despite its unstable rivers, fragile mud brick architecture, and lack of stone, timber, and metal. That achievement becomes a model for later Sumerian cities, even when those cities compete fiercely with one another. Nippur, Kish, Lagash, and other centres inherit a landscape where the city is no longer a strange experiment. but the basic unit of political and sacred life. Each will develop its own identity, gods, rivalries, rulers, and institutions, yet all stand in a world Uruk helped make possible. The first great city becomes the ancestor of cities that will finally speak more clearly in written history. Its administrative legacy may be even deeper. The habits of sealing, counting, storing, and recording do not disappear when the Uruk expansion weakens. They mature. Proto-writing develops into cuneiform. Numerical tablets and commodity lists eventually open the path toward a scribal world capable of recording names, offerings, titles, land, law, myth, diplomacy, and royal ambition. This transformation takes time, and scholars still debate many details of how early writing changed from administrative notation into a fuller script. But the direction is undeniable. Uruk's practical need to manage goods becomes one of humanity's great intellectual thresholds. The clay tablet, first tied to accounts and obligations, becomes the medium through which later Mesopotamia remembers itself. That is one of history's quiet ironies. The people who helped create writing remain partly hidden behind the earliest writing's limitations. They invent tools that allow later kings and scribes to speak, but their own world speaks mostly in numbers, signs, and sealed transactions. They stand at the doorway and do not fully pass through it. The later epics, hymns, laments, school texts, and royal inscriptions of Mesopotamia would have been impossible without the administrative foundations of the Uruk age. Yet those foundations preserve few personal voices. The forgotten empire gives memory to civilization while remaining, in many ways, forgotten by memory itself. Uruk also leaves behind a new relationship between power and information. Earlier authority can depend heavily on kinship, face-to-face reputation, custom, and local ritual. Uruk shows that authority can be stored, verified, and transmitted through objects. A seal impression can authorize action beyond the presence of the seal holder. A tablet can hold account beyond the memory of the person who made it. A ration system can bind workers to institutions through measured distribution. A storeroom can turn surplus into political leverage. These things may look mundane, but they mark the beginning of a long history in which states, temples, palaces, and empires rule not only by force, but by records. The later Mesopotamian palace and temple economies inherit this logic. Kings will eventually boast of building canals, feeding gods, defeating enemies, and founding cities. But beneath their inscriptions lies a world of scribes, fields, labor gangs, ration lists, sealed containers, and measured obligations. No ruler, however glorious his titles, can rule without administration. Uruk's hidden legacy is the discovery that complexity itself can be governed if it is made visible through signs. Once people, goods, and labor become countable, they become more manageable. That is both an achievement and a warning. The same system that feeds workers can bind them. The same record that protects a transaction can strengthen an institution over a person. Its legacy of long-distance exchange is just as important. The Uruk world demonstrates that a southern Mesopotamian city can extend its influence through networks of need and attraction. It does not possess everything it desires, so it must connect. Timber, copper, stone, and prestige materials draw it toward distant lands. Outposts, trading communities, local partnerships, and administrative habits create early forms of regional integration. Later empires will make these connections more formal, more militarized, and more loudly proclaimed. But Uruk already shows the principle a center's power is measured by how well it makes distant landscapes serve its appetite. The first empire-like system may not have had clearly drawn borders, but it had reach. This reach changes other regions as well. Northern Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and Iran do not simply receive Uruk influence and vanish beneath it. They respond, adapt, resist, imitate, and transform. The result is a more connected Near East, where local societies become aware of wider systems of exchange and authority. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every regional outcome, but the contact itself is beyond doubt. Uruk helps create a world in which distance matters differently. A settlement is no longer only a local place. It can become a node in a chain of movement, goods, techniques, symbols, and ambitions. The city's symbolic legacy may also endure through later memory. Uruk remains famous in Mesopotamian tradition long after the period of its earliest greatness. It becomes associated with kingship, monumental walls, divine favour, and legendary figures, most famously Gilgamesh in later literature. These later traditions cannot be read as straightforward records of the 4th millennium BCE, and they must not be treated as direct eyewitness memory. Yet they show that Uruk continued to occupy a special place in the Mesopotamian imagination. The city that rose before clear history became, in later history, a place where myth and memory gathered. Its earliest empire-like age was dim, but its name did not disappear. Perhaps the deepest legacy is the idea that civilization can become bigger than any person can understand. Uruk creates systems whose full shape may have been invisible even to those living inside them. A farmer sees the field and the canal, a worker sees the ration bowl, a scribe sees the tablet, a seal holder sees the storeroom, a trader sees the river route, a builder sees the brick line rising, but the system as a whole stretches beyond individual sight. That is the beginning of a very modern kind of power life organized by institutions so large that people feel only the part touching them directly. The forgotten empire beneath history therefore survives not because it left a clear royal story, but because it changed the conditions under which all later stories are written. It leaves cities where villages once defined the horizon. It leaves records where memory once lived mainly in speech. It leaves institutions capable of gathering labour and surplus. It leaves trade networks that pull distant landscapes into shared systems. It leaves inequality, dependency, craft, spectacle, sacred authority, and administrative genius woven together. Uruk may not have ruled like later empires, but it ruled the future by inventing many of the tools later empires could not live without. The wind settles softly over the old plain, moving across places where rivers have shifted, marshes have retreated and returned, and cities have risen on the bones of cities. Uruk is no longer the dazzling horizon it once was. Its whitewashed temple no longer catches the sun above crowded streets. Its seal cutters no longer bend over stone. Its workers no longer line up with ration bowls in their hands. The boats that move through its channels are gone, and the storerooms that once held grain have fallen back into the earth that made them. Yet the silence is not empty. Beneath the mound, in broken clay and buried walls, the first great urban age still remains. It remains in the idea that people can gather by the tens of thousands and live by systems larger than kinship. It remains in the habit of counting, recording, sealing, and trusting marks pressed into matter. It remains in every later city that depends on fields it cannot see, workers it cannot name, and routes that stretch beyond the horizon. It remains in the fragile bargain between abundance and control, between cooperation and inequality, between human imagination and human burden. The people of Uruk did not know they were becoming ancient. They did not know they would stand at the edge of history, close enough to invent its tools, yet too early to leave their own voices clearly behind. They lived in the urgency of water, grain, heat, labour, hunger, devotion, ambition, and repair. They built in mud because mud was what the land gave them. They counted because memory was no longer enough. They expanded because the city needed what the plain could not provide. They vanished as individuals, but the shape of their world continued. So the forgotten empire that ruled before history was written does not end with a final battle or a last king's name. It ends as landscapes often end slowly, unevenly, becoming something else. Its outposts fade, its records change, its methods pass into other hands. The great city sinks into layers of its own past, waiting beneath dust, brick, and time, and above it, the wind keeps moving across the Mesopotamian plain, over reeds, fields, ruins, and riverbeds, carrying no words from the first city's lost people, only the lingering trace of what they made before history learned to speak.